Whenever we say God, our minds tend to run to the conceptual, to the abstract. We start thinking in philosophical categories, even if that's not our natural way of thinking. God is unchanging, omnipotent, all-knowing. And then we take these abstract categories and we test them against real life problems. If God is all perfect, all powerful, perfectly loving, why did I hit my head against the hatchback of our station wagon last week and scream out an obscenity in front of 35 strangers in the Costco parking lot? Right? The answers are rarely satisfying, so we push deeper into further abstraction. Why does God let good things happen to bad people? Why does God let bad people experience good things? Does God have a God? How many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Meanwhile, God herself does not act conceptually. God operates in concrete urgency, in history, in people's lives. He shows up in Moses' life not as an idea, but as a voice speaking from a burning bush. Moses, you know the story, right? Moses is an Israelite. His people have been slaves in Egypt for generations. They are trapped, caught, pressed down by cruel overlords, living underneath an indifferent heaven, or so they think. And then God spoke to Moses and revealed himself to be as close as the flames of a warming fire on a cold winter night. God is no longer abstract, remote, distant, unmoved, but is suddenly compassionate, involved, suffering. Moses, I know your people's pain, and I will lead them out of it. I promise you, I will lead them into freedom. Moses, I know your people's pain. Dead flesh can't feel the scalpel, but a living God can. I will lead your people into the promised land I promised your ancestor Abraham. Standing on this promise, Moses turns and makes demands on Pharaoh. Let my people go. Where did he find the courage? Imagine that moment, staring the emperor, the king, the almighty Pharaoh in the face to face, and saying, let my people go. Knowing what? Well, what did Moses know? The future hasn't happened yet. The future doesn't exist. It isn't even real. All Moses has is the moment that he's in, right? Face to face with Pharaoh. He still finds the courage. Let my people go. Somehow Moses knows that power will bend to righteousness, that although his people are enslaved in the moment, someday they will be free. So Moses is bold in the moment. Let my people go. Moses' faith in the future, his hope, allows him to act boldly in the moment. Let my people go. And of course, Pharaoh says no. So God, who does not act in abstractions, acts instead in boils and frogs and blood, right? Remember the story? God rains a series of plagues so awful, the emperor surrenders and tells Moses and his people they are free to go, to flee. And so the Israelites run for it, or rather limp for it. Underfed for generations, brainwashed by their overlords, easily confused, denied all agency, totally uncertain, the Israelites move slowly. Watching from his throne, watching free labor inch its way out of his kingdom, Pharaoh reconsiders. And he sends his soldiers to recapture every man, woman, and child that he's just freed. Enraged and excited, the Egyptian army flies after the stumbling Israelites, chariots thundering. And eventually, Moses leads his people right to the edge of the Red Sea. And they are trapped between Pharaoh's killers and storm-tossed, dark, deep water. The Israelites prepared to die, right? And then the sea parts. The Hebrew people walk across dry land and into freedom. The sea closes. Horses, drivers, officers, foot soldiers, they all drown. The deep water covers them. They sink to the depths like a stone. And looking over their shoulders, the Israelites can barely believe what they are seeing. They can't even begin to process what they have just witnessed, what they've suffered, and what they've survived. Freud says that when a person experiences trauma, I should stop and just give us a bit of an off-ramp here if it's necessary. I'm not going to get into specific trauma, but rather a little bit of trauma theory from Freud and Aviva Zornberg and others who followed Freud, that is. When a person experiences trauma, the event is so startling, so horrific, that the mind shuts down, which means that the event itself isn't really remembered. You know that it happened, but it is as if you were absent. You know that this pain disfigured you, but it is as if you were absent from its occurrence. And so you are haunted by half memories and the delayed experience of this disfiguring pain that you suffered but can't process. And this is why Freud says the event then arises in your nightmares or in your fantasies belatedly, over and over again, as the mind's doomed attempt to master and control and experience what was never fully grasped in the first place. So to be traumatized is somehow to be dead to your own experience, even as you're haunted by it. Aviva Zornberg, the great Jewish biblical scholar, she says that this is the significance of God telling Moses, I feel your people's pain. I feel the Israelites' pain, God says. They can't feel it, not fully, because they're traumatized. So God carries the pain of slavery for them. God feels the searing wound. God holds the Hebrews' pain in storage. And they run, they flee, they escape. But they're not quite free of Egypt yet, because God can't hold their pain forever. And if Moses and his people don't take that pain back, don't take it back into their own hearts and their own minds, don't feel it, they will always be haunted by Egypt. They will remain trapped in Egypt, no matter where they live. They need to process what they've been through. Zornberg says, clearly that will not happen overnight. It will require the wilderness and 40 years. It will require space and time. After the drama of the Red Sea, the Israelites wander then in the desert for 40 years. And as they wander, they are healed and they resist healing. Anyone who's ever been to therapy and gone 1 week feeling your heart full of hope and then somehow managed to miss the next 3 appointments know how we can resist the healing that we need. 40 years. And all the while, Moses spoke. They argued with him and they listened to him. They ignored God, and Moses kept on speaking, not glibly, not with absolute eloquence. This was not an eloquent man. He himself says he was heavy of tongue and slow of lip. He stammered. And the stammer was a part of the message. God only reveals herself in indirect ways through people who must stammer. How can we speak of God? The first thing that ought to scare you when you're visiting a new church is if the preacher is excessively glib, right? We ought to stammer when we speak of God. Moses stammers, but he keeps on speaking, and he keeps on reminding his people of the promise that God has made to them. Leaning into the future he's been guaranteed. Moses always one step out. Yes, but we have been promised this. We will keep on walking. We will get there. He encourages his people and he scolds them and he leads them, standing on the promises of God. His heart is full of hope that one day, someday, the people will be free of Egypt and finally healed, finally at home in the land God has promised them. Moses, always with his mind and his heart on the better tomorrow God has promised him. I wonder if anyone ever asked him about being in the moment. Be here now, Moses. Don't let the future steal your present. Don't let your mind rob you of this precious instant. It's all you've got. Nostalgia binds us to a past that no longer exists, and hope pulls us into a future that doesn't even exist. Both of them conspire to annihilate the present moment, which is all we have. More than that, the thinking goes, to grasp this never-returning moment, to be here now, in this instant, with yourself, to live in the uncurtailed present, is to be with God. Right? That's the heart of contemporary spirituality right there, I think. 60 years ago, everybody went to church. Every Christian went to church, at least. Every nominal Christian, everyone whose parents were Christian. Today, they sell plaques and pillows with mindfulness mantras on them at Target. Be here now. It's not a new idea. Nietzsche and Hegel both believed that the eternal is only available in the present moment. Goethe, the great German writer, he said this in a poem that you know our ancestors at St. Paul's had memorized, many of them. Why go chasing distant fancies? Lo, the good is ever near. Only learn to grasp your chances. Happiness is always here. Last week I was in the grocery store and this little boy, maybe 4 years old, came racing past me with a fistful of cheese, little yellow cubes. He'd lifted almost half a pound from the free sample display. And he was running and eating as fast as he could. His dad was about half an aisle behind him shouting loudly, "Alexander, be mindful." Well, you could argue that he was being mindful. Fully in the moment, this little kid. Be mindful. 60 years ago, when everybody went to church, many of us didn't think much about the deeper truths Christianity insists upon. And I think the same could be said about our contemporary infatuation with being in the moment. I don't mean to suggest that mindfulness practice is nonsense. I've had it urged on me. I've done it. My mind is not built to meditate, but I've tried it and I've benefited from it. I know that it can help you feel your feelings and be less reactive. And I certainly don't mean to insult the deeper Buddhist understanding that mindfulness practices often grow out of. But I think there's a significant distinction to be made between a practice that can help us through the everyday and the reality of the universe. Or at least the understanding of it, depicted in these windows that has settled into many of our bones. We can't just appropriate another culture's wisdom and expect it to rest easily next to the Christian conception of time or God. Jürgen Moltmann says, "The believer is not set at the high noon of life, but at the dawn of a new day. at the point where night and day, things passing and things to come, grapple with each other. So the believer does not simply take the day as it comes, living in the moment, but looks beyond the day to the things which have been promised. Hope lets us live in the moment in the light of the possibilities that God is giving us. What if the present is full of pain? Not to go all hypocritically privileged on you, but I wonder what happens if we were to conduct a class analysis or consider the social location of our present day enthusiasm for mindfulness practice. Hope makes us ready to bear the cross of the present. Hope is what let Moses get out of Egypt. Moses witnessed an Egyptian soldier kill a Hebrew slave. And Moses turned and he killed the murderer. Moses was trapped in the moment, trapped in this violent and vicious cycle. And hope in the promises of God, that's what set him free. His hope carries him and his people out of Egypt. The God of the Exodus is not an eternal presence, always living in the moment, but instead, the God of the Exodus and the resurrection gives her presence to those who follow her into the future that she is dreaming and creating for us. Christ-like love doesn't look at the non-existent future and say there's nothing out there. It doesn't even exist. It's not real. Real love looked at nothingness and said, let there be light, and made a world out of it. Real love saw Good Friday looming and said, after 3 days, I will rise again. I'm talking about the kind of love that looked at the traumatized, suffering people enslaved in Egypt, cried tears for them, and then said, Moses. God let Moses see the realization of this promise. He's there on top of a mountain that is on top of a mountain, and he is looking out at this broad span of land at Canaan, all those beautiful place names that Lauren just read. And he looks out and he sees what God has promised his people. He sees the realization of this promise, and then he dies. And that's sad. But that's life. Kafka says, Moses fails to enter Canaan not because his life is too short, but because it is a human life. God promises to dry all your tears, to turn your mourning into dancing, to heal every wound you've ever suffered, to make you whole. God promises this to each and to every one of us. And the fact that we won't realize paradise on earth doesn't mean these promises are not real. I've said before that we hear the hint of what we've been guaranteed and the things that grab us the most. This list of C.S. Lewis I just love. Something not to be identified with, but always on the verge of breaking through. The smell of cut wood in the workshop, or the clap of water against the boat's side, night and day, your whole life long. You've never been in paradise, but you have heard it in the things that deeply possess your soul. All of them were promised, not quite fulfilled. So the things you love the most, your favorite tree, the song that comes on the radio and makes you turn it up and pull over to the side of the road, the smell of rosemary, the hum of your bicycle tire against the asphalt, all these things, they offer a tantalizing glimpse of the glory that God has in store for you, of paradise. And all of these things, they tend to die away just as they reach your ear. that doesn't mean the promise isn't real. It doesn't mean that you can't live today embodying the reality of that promise, living in the paradise you've been guaranteed, trying to at least, letting your faith in the future shape who you are and how you live today, right now. In 2006, the journalist John Jeremiah Sullivan wrote an essay titled "The Last Comeback of Axl Rose." He traveled to Lafayette, Indiana, Axl's hometown, and he interviewed various people who knew Axl Rose growing up. We all know who Axl Rose is. If you don't, I'm sorry to have to be the person to tell you this. But Axl Rose, the lead singer for the rock band Guns N' Roses, right? Sort of a famous malcontent, big rock star. Someone said Axl Rose was the leader of the last rock band who had no self-consciousness about being rock stars, right? Just fully in it, when I was in high school at least. So here's what Sullivan says. Dana Gregory is Axl's oldest friend. When I sat down with him in the back patio of a bar called Sergeant Preston's, he had sunglasses on. When he pushed them up into his bushy gray hair, he had unnervingly pale mineral blue eyes that had seen plenty of sunrises. He'd been there. You knew it before he even spoke. He had done a spectacular amount of crazy things in his life, and the rest of his life would be spent reflecting on these things and taking it day by day. He finished beers quickly, and he used repeatedly an idiom that I have always loved, right on. Meant not that's correct, but simply yes, as in, you like to party? Right on. What did you do for Axl in LA? I fixed things that broke. His condo had these giant mirrors going all around it, and every now and then he'd take that spaceman statue they give you when you win an award on MTV, and he'd smash all the mirrors with it. Well, he slept till 4 in the afternoon every day. Somebody had to let the guy in when he came to fix the mirrors. That was my job. Sullivan says, we sat there for a long time. Dana has 4 children and 4 grandchildren. When I said he seemed young for that, he said, started young. There was a lot of experimentation. Then he said that what he wants to do with the rest of his life is simple. I want to lower the level of dysfunction for the next generation. God has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. The fact that Dana Gregory is going to have to suffer no small amount of dysfunction in his own life, maybe for the rest of his life, doesn't mean he can't be on the top of a mountain that is on the top of a mountain and peer into his grandchildren's lives and see something better for them. The fact that the promise isn't realized in Moses' lifetime doesn't mean it won't be realized eventually. And you know that when Dana Gregory holds one of his grandchildren on his lap, he's in that future that he's been promised. So what if God doesn't want you to live in the moment? What if God wants you to live in the future that he's promised you? Amen.